Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Our Shakespeare, where I talk about Shakespeare as it relates to the here and now. Today, I want to talk about King Lear. So, yesterday, here in America, it was Father's Day. And what better way to honor fathers than to think about the play King Lear. Now, I know that's a little bit weird, and those of you who know King Lear probably thinks that's a little strange. But King Lear is all about parenting, it's all about fathers, it's all about how they relate to their children. And so that got me thinking, maybe I should do a King Lear video. So here it is, King Lear video. I'm going to try to keep this video short, so I'm going to fly through a lot of things. First of all, King Lear, probably written about 1606. That's what most scholars seem to think, 1606, 1607, somewhere around there. There was a quarto published of it in 1608, and then a subsequent publication of King Lear in Shakespeare's first folio. The folio version, the quarto version, do differ a little bit in some relatively significant ways, not the least of which is who it gives the final lines to. Contemporary editors usually conflate the quarto version and the folio version, and you don't usually see a pure publication nowadays of just one of the versions. They often kind of borrow from both. So before I talk about the plot, I want to talk about, very briefly, the concept of plot versus subplot. Shakespeare often uses a subplot to comment on similar themes to the actual main plot. And this story is no different. Shakespeare's main plot in King Lear follows the character of Lear, but there's a very substantial subplot in it involving a character named Gloucester. Lear with his daughters, Gloucester with his sons, and there's some very similar things happening, and those stories are interrelated, but you don't necessarily need the subplot for the main plot, although the two do intersect. And they both comment on a similar theme. And what is that theme? Well, here in this play, both of the plots relate to families failing to understand each other. Parents failing to understand their children, and that failure to understand leading to family divisions that ultimately bring about disaster and epic level tragedy for both families. Okay, so what happens in the plot of King Lear? Well, King Lear is getting old, he's getting tired, he's struggling to rule his kingdom. He has 3 daughters, and the way he decides to deal with his struggles is to divide the kingdom amongst his 3 daughters. And then he himself plans to visit his 3 daughters in their various areas of the kingdom with 100 knights in turn. Sounds like a lovely plan. Well, what's not so lovely is how he plans to divide the kingdom. And what he does is he basically has this big ceremony, and he calls all of his daughters together in front of an audience and basically asks his daughters, tell me how much you love me. And based on how much you love me will depend on how much of the kingdom and which parts of the kingdom I give to you. So his first 2 daughters, Goneril and Regan, both profess profound love for him. He's very happy. He gives them 2 great portions of the kingdom. And then up comes his youngest daughter, Cordelia, who he protests he probably loves most of all, and says, you know, tell me how much you love me and I will give you the remaining third of my kingdom. And she basically says, I love you as much as a daughter should, no more, no less, and that's about it. Well, Lear gets really upset about this, so he basically banishes her. He sends her off with her husband, the King of France, who agrees to marry her, and banishes her from the kingdom, not giving her any of the kingdom at all. Lear has a very loyal character named Kent, who actually stands up for Cordelia and tells Lear, hey, you're stupid to banish her, maybe you shouldn't do that. Lear gets upset with him for questioning his authority, and he banishes Kent as well. Well, Kent decides to stick around and disguise himself and serve King Lear as a disguised person later on in the play. So that's the beginning of plot 1. Plot 2, involving the Duke of Gloucester, involves his sons, Edgar and Edmund, and Edmund wants to basically have his father's lands and properties. And so he convinces his father Gloucester that Gloucester's son Edgar wants to kill him and take his lands. So Gloucester believes Edmund and calls on Edgar to be arrested. Edgar escapes, but is basically a fugitive from the law. So he decides to flee into the wilderness and disguise himself as a beggar named Poor Tom. Meanwhile, Lear decides to visit his daughters, as he said he would do, with his 100 knights, and visit his daughters' portions of the kingdom. Well, long story short, Both daughters are not happy about this. One of them dismisses half of Lear's knights, saying he doesn't need 100 knights with him. Lear gets upset about this, goes to stay with the other daughter. The other daughter says, well, you can only stay with me if you dismiss all of your knights. Lear is upset about this affront to his authority, rants and raves, and then they end up kicking him out of the house for all of his ranting and raving and what have you. And he ends up basically wandering in the wilderness himself in a terrible storm. And a lot of stuff happens, and I'm going to try to really compress it so hopefully it makes sense. So, long story as short as possible, Lear ends up lost wandering in the wilderness. Gloucester ends up trying to stand up for Lear, tries to go to Goneril and Regan and say, hey, you know, you've mistreated Lear, take him back. They get upset about all of this. They call Gloucester a traitor. They gouge out Gloucester's eyes. Gloucester, without any eyes, ends up wandering in the wilderness alone and befriends his son, not knowing it's his son, thinking it's a beggar named Poor Tom. And this beggar named Poor Tom ends up taking care of Gloucester, leading him through the wilderness, Gloucester not having any idea that it's his son, Edgar, who he banished. Lear, meanwhile, is out in the wilderness. He's with the fool, and he's with his newfound servant, who's actually Kent in disguise. And Gloucester and Lear end up meeting each other in the wilderness. It's very apparent that Lear is losing his mind, and Gloucester is upset about this. Gloucester attempts to commit suicide by throwing himself off the cliffs of Dover, which he doesn't actually do. Going back to Goneril and Regan and their husbands, Cornwall and Albany, have heard that France, with Cordelia, is actually planning to wage war because of the misdeeds of Goneril and Regan to restore order to the kingdoms. There's a war, bad things happen, France actually loses the war, Cordelia is taken captive, Lear is taken captive from the wilderness. Lear and Cordelia have a chance to see each other. Lear acknowledges the error of his ways, realizes he treated Cordelia poorly. Cordelia gets hanged. Lear dies of grief at Cordelia being hanged, but whereas Goneril and Regan end up having a lot of infighting together over control of the kingdom, and they both end up dying, Goneril killing Regan and then killing herself, and Cornwall ends up getting killed by a servant. Of that whole family, the only people that are still alive are is the Duke of Albany. He kind of changes sides at the last minute, and Edgar ends up revealing his true self to his father Gloucester. Gloucester realizes the error of his ways and that he did not treat his son poorly, and he dies of both joy and grief at knowing how his son has forgiven him and taken care of him. They forgive each other. Gloucester dies of grief and joy at the same time. Edgar and Edmund have a fight, and Edgar ends up killing Edmund, but Lear is dead, Gloucester is dead, all three daughters are dead, and all is just really terrible. Albany's pretty much left to pick up the pieces. And that's how the play ends. So I have a couple of takeaways. Number one of my takeaways is that when families allow themselves to divide, when parents allow families to divide, bad things happen for everyone. It doesn't go well for anyone in the family. The role of the parent when there's division in the family is to be the bridge between that division rather than the river between that division. And in King Lear, both Lear and Gloucester end up making the divisions worse rather than trying to bridge those divisions. So that's takeaway number one. Takeaway number two, actually, is how parenting styles nowadays have changed a lot since I've been alive. I've observed that parenting has gone from kind of a mainstream model of authority and punishment and rewards to today's model, which is more about positivity and more about bringing about self-esteem in a child. And those are two very different ways of looking at parenting. I happen to think that today's model works better from my own experience being a father of three, and as well as being a teacher and working with students in that way. But let's talk about how this relates to King Lear. Both Lear and Gloucester epitomize that older parenting style. Both of them react harshly and dole out enormous punishment to their children when their children threaten their sense of authority. Imagine how the events of the play would have been different if Lear and Gloucester had shown to their children unconditional positive regard, given them the benefit of the doubt, helped the siblings work out their differences, rather than doling out punishment, rather than seeking to divide the family further. So to summarize, perhaps if Lear had shown unconditional positive regard to Cordelia, and Gloucester had shown unconditional positive regard to Edgar, and sought to be the bridge for their family's divisions rather than further dividing them, the whole play might have turned out very differently, and things may not have gone so poorly in the end. So those are my thoughts on King Lear as it relates to parenting and today. There's a lot more that can be said about this play. Perhaps I'll say it someday, but that's what I've got for now. So, a day or two late, happy Father's Day to all fathers, and if you've never read King Lear or seen a production of it, I highly encourage you to. It is so good. Thanks for watching.